Okay, well, it is a few minutes past and it's not a very long session today, so we will get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Mark Dean, for those of you whom I haven't met before, and I'm the CEO and founder of Masse, and very, very pleased to be here. I was delighted to be invited to have this crucial conversation today with you about crucial conversations on Are You OK Day. Want to say in advance, thank you very much to the organisers and to Nikki from the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence in Exciton Science, which I will probably refer to as the centre for the rest of our introductions. If you just dialed in, welcome. I hope you're having a lovely day so far. I'd like to just begin this session by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the lands from which we're all dialing in today. And I pay my warm and sincere respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So I want to say thank you in advance to our panelists today for joining us, and I'll do some introductions now. Firstly, Nikki Stratton. Nikki is a media and communications expert and has quite a fascinating career. So I'd just like to share with you a little bit more about that. Nikki joined the Centre from Fair Trade Australia and New Zealand, where they worked in the communications and digital role and helped Fair Trade to transform the lives of small-scale farmers and workers in developing countries. The highlight of Nikki's time in Fair Trade was visiting the Eastern Highlands of Papua New Guinea to meet the fascinating members of the Highlands Organic Agricultural Cooperative and other coffee-producing organisations. Fascinating and fabulous. Prior to joining Fair Trade, Nikki worked as a writer, editor and journalist in the Australia and in the UK. They reported on major sporting events, including the 2018 FIFA World Cup. Nikki is strongly motivated to further the causes of sustainability and equality, and no doubt a great motivator to be here today. Thanks, Nikki, and welcome.
Thanks very much, Mark.
Next on our panel, Aronia Tocalidis is Manager of Counselling and Psychological Services at the University of Melbourne. A clinical psychologist, Aronia has worked for over 20 years in public mental health services, state government and tertiary education, and acted as clinical consultant to services including universities, hospital networks, emergency services and private organisations. Aronia's core areas of interest are pretty plentiful, but include, among other things, facilitating wellness and work-life balance and mental health outcomes. Welcome, Aronia. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark.
I'd like to introduce, it's my pleasure to introduce now Allison Funston. Allison is a senior lecturer at Monash University, is Deputy Director and a Chief Investigator and a member of the Executive Committee, as well as the Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Committee for the Centre. Her research within the Centre explores the enormous potential of hybrid inorganic organic systems within specific systems designed for light harvesting, solar up conversion, singlet fission, and directed energy transfer. Very exciting. Welcome, Alison. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Mark, for that very nice introduction. Pleased to be here.
Lovely to have you here. Thank you. Girish, welcome. Girish Lakwani is the Chief Investigator and Deputy Director for the Centre and a member of the Executive Committee. Girish is an Associate Professor at the University of Sydney. His expertise covers chiroptical spectroscopy, single molecule spectroscopy, device physics, and master equation-based core-grained simulations. Girish coordinates programs across the themes of materials, theory, instrumentation and devices, and has a great personal and professional passion for mental health. Welcome, Girish. Lovely to have you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for a kind introduction, Mark.
Absolute pleasure. Alison, hello there. Alison Campbell is a PhD student based at the University of Sydney. She's a mental health trained, first aid trained member of the Centre, as well as a member of the Centre's Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Her current research aims to understand the role of interfaces in energy transfer processes, particularly in hybrid organic-inorganic structures. Welcome, Alison. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Mark. It's great to be here.
And last but not least, Ting Shen. Ting Shen is a PhD student at the University of Melbourne. He is also a mental health first aid trained member of the Centre, as well as a member of the Centre's Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Committee. His PhD project focuses on developing novel synthesis protocols for 3,5 semiconductor nanocrystals and fine control of nanocrystal growth. Sounds complex and also fascinating. Welcome, Ting Shen. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for the introduction, Mark.
That's a pleasure. Lovely to have you all here. So throughout this session, I'll be calling on our panelists for what will be a pretty open and informal conversation. And we're going to be talking about mental health from a slightly different perspective in terms of it being a continuum rather than just focusing on what it's like to experience mental illness. We will, in the true spirit of Are You OK Day, be talking about some of these crucial conversations, and we'll be sharing with you a model that you'll be able to access after the session as well. And that model is based on 5 simple low-risk steps for having a conversation with someone you're worried about, someone who may be struggling. But before we go there, I wanted to really just generate this acknowledgement that we have all been through some pretty rough times over the past couple of years in particular. And the current environment has been really extraordinary. Wherever you're dialing in from, I'm sure that you have some experience currently or recently with this. Adjustment fatigue is a big one. When we are constantly going through these states of uncertainty and having to adjust to working on-site, off-site, remote working, not to mention all of the different pressures that come in life generally. And physical isolation is a risk factor here that we must acknowledge. I think that for the purposes of today, we'll be really honing in on how we overcome some of those risk factors. How do we get past some of the negatives of physical isolation by reaching out and having conversations with each other, and in particular with people we might be a little bit worried about. And of course, our bodies and minds' reactions to traumatic situations form a big part of the risk landscape. So it's just really helpful, I think, for us to stop and reflect quietly on the fact that we have all experienced some traumatic situations, generally in life, of course, but certainly over the last 18 months in particular. It mounts up to stressors and strains on our mental and physical health, not to mention our sense of emotional well-being. Hyperproductivity and burnout. Not sure whether anyone's really thought about this or done much research into it, but gosh, I've spent a lot of time looking at this since around about May, June last year, and some interesting research came out from Oxford University that talked about the statistics being in the order of about 72% of people in the UK at that time associating with being in a hyperproductive mode. So that is associated with and resulting from this sense that I'm out of control of a whole lot of things going on around me, but I can control my work and my research and my study and my career. And if I just focus on that and keep doing it more and more and more, everything will work out. And of course, I'm oversimplifying this syndrome of hyperproductivity, if I can call it that. Burnout is, of course, a state of dis-ease that is associated with typically occupational stress. So that would cover research, studying, working, and typically it's when you feel a state of exhaustion, a sense of disconnect, or perhaps even cynicism about your usual work or research, starting to just question it in a way that I haven't done before, and productivity is affected. But the important thing is, just like all things that we talk about in relation to mental health, there is a continuum and a temporariness about every state. So it's the help and support that we get and the things that we do to look after ourselves that we'll cover off at the end of this session. I'm going to stop talking very shortly. I want to just introduce this conversation about mental health as a continuum, as a spectrum. And so if we think about this in a somewhat simplified way, at one end of this spectrum on the right-hand side, we've got the person or the state that we may be in from time to time, we might call thriving or flourishing. Now, before we talk about languishing and this concept that mental illness is absolutely not a sort of a permanent state necessarily of suffering, I just want to throw open to our panel this question of thriving. What does that look like to you? How would you know if you were in a state of thriving? What are some of the things that might be going on for you? Now, I might just ask to open this up. Alison Campbell, do you have any thoughts on this one? What does thriving look like to you?
I think that it's less about what my actual outputs are and more about how I feel about them. So for me, it would be feeling that I am doing good work and achieving something. And that's kind of a self-perpetuating cycle that if I can see myself doing good work, I feel more happy to continue trying. That would be what it looks like for me in a work context.
I really like that. Thanks very much for sharing that, Alison. I'm picturing this combination here of positive emotion that you're feeling about the results of the inputs of your work, and also a thought process that is about acknowledging that you're ticking some boxes here, you're making progress, and your thought process around that progress is positive, constructive, and in some ways self-rewarding. No doubt getting little dopamine bursts every time you tick a box and go, yeah, I feel good about that. Thank you. And so might ask one more panelist member, this state of thriving. Nikki, might be a good time to ask you, Nikki, given that you're in the middle of a week where you're doing a bit of the stuff that helps you to thrive. What are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, that's right, Mark. So for anyone who's not aware, I'm having a staycation at the moment. Lots of annual leave that we can't use to go anywhere at the moment. But I've really come around in the last couple of years to the idea of taking leave, even if you can't go anywhere or do anything. And to answer the question more directly, thriving for me, I think, is when I feel enthusiastic about things, when I feel well rested, and I have kind of energy and motivation to pursue things that I enjoy. That's usually when I can tell that I'm feeling good and doing well. So, and yeah, this week that's consisted of lots of all my kind of normal routines of self-care and doing good things for myself, like exercise and cooking, and not having to squeeze them around work or other commitments, just making that the number one priority.
I like that. And to borrow a little bit from what we're going to finish up with today, Nikki, it sounded very much to me like you made quite a specific plan of those things that you value that will bring you joy in your household for this week.
Yeah, so I mean, I have a kind of a long, I don't want to call it a list, but like I think I have a suite of tools at my disposal that help me to look after myself. And even if it's a normal working week, I try and fit those in, things like meditation and exercise, yoga, journaling, and yeah, definitely cooking is a big part of my life. And normally I try and do as many of those things as I can around work. And then when I've got a week off like this where we can't go anywhere, then it makes sense just to put those at the top of the priority list. And then if you do them slowly and with real kind of commitment, then before you know it, the whole day's gone, just taking care of yourself. And it's really quite nice.
That's lovely, isn't it? Sometimes it's that positive distraction, and other times it is no doubt a real positive emotion builder to be getting involved in your favorite cooking, your favorite foods, activities, even in that staycation sense. And it's wonderful to hear some real, I think, quite inspiring talk of those staycations when our other assumptions might be, gosh, can't go anywhere, so what's the point? And I think it's a wonderful message. So we might come back to that towards the end as well, Nikki. Thank you. So in the middle here, languishing. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of this, this language used in relation to our overall state of well-being in recent times. We used to talk quite a lot about feeling a bit wobbly in the middle here, where we're not kind of thriving, but we're not necessarily in a state of crisis either. And I was having a brief chat with Aronia about this a little bit earlier. Aronia, this language of languishing, what does it mean to you coming from a clinical psych perspective and as a manager and team member?
Yeah, well, I think it's that whole thing of we're not thriving, there's no severe issues here, but it's just that blah kind of just here we are and just not getting the normal joy out of every day. And finding that this can come, I mean, I hear figures released about, you know, cases, and immediately I just feel like I just go flat a bit, you know. That's the kind of thing for me. And how to keep that at the back of my mind to kind of get back in touch with the things that actually help me thrive, because you can just languish and just days go by and nothing terrible has happened, but it's not a, you know, joyful, it's not a meaningful, it's just things are missing there. So, and also not only for everyone, like even for people like health professionals like myself, you know, in your earlier slide about people working hard, like this is the busiest we've ever worked in our professional lives. Just demand is very high. But even as just people ourselves, like we're all also fighting this going between thriving, languishing, and sometimes not functioning at all. So just seeing ourselves and monitoring how we go so that we're aware of it and doing things that will help us to move towards thriving, because we'd all like to be at thriving most of the time. We'd all like to be that green tree. Yeah,
we'd love it, wouldn't we? But there's something here also about detecting an acceptance that we do move up and down this continuum, and sometimes we may be more towards the languishing, more towards the really struggling end, and that is a sort of a normal state in terms of the human experience, probably even more profound now to recognise that than even a couple of years ago.
Yes. So we've always talked about people, you know, we've always talked about this continuum, the mental health spectrum, I guess. But what's even more impactful at the moment is that the whole world is going through a major, you know, pandemic. So a lot more of us are finding that's an added layer of stress and anxiety, and possibly meaning that more of us are going into the languishing phase more so than before. But yes, absolutely going up and down with that, and talking, you know, we can talk about ways of how do we help ourselves to move up and down, accept some of it, and then but what are the things that might be helpful to move us along.
Fantastic.
That would be great. Yeah.
I think we'll get onto that very shortly. Thank you very much, Aronia. Might just, before we move on to the conversation about what it means to be struggling, just this, the language of mental health and talking about mental health in all of its contexts is I think, a really helpful place to start, because we don't have to necessarily wait until somebody is really struggling, or perhaps until we've noticed, gosh, you know, in terms of functioning, this person is showing signs of experiencing some pretty severe impacts. We can talk about mental health across the whole spectrum, which normalizes the conversation wherever we're coming from. So I just, I think that's a neat place to start when we start to look at this question of whether it's possible to be languishing sometimes, thriving other times, possibly even to be experiencing a mental health issue, but still have the capacity to thrive, depending on what we do, what sort of help and support we get. So that brings me to this question of is whether it's possible to be in a situation where you have experience with mental health issues, perhaps you have a diagnosed or diagnosable mental health condition, and also to thrive. So I think that's a really important one just to sit and contemplate for a moment. But I might ask the panelists as well, now, what are your perspectives on this? Perhaps Allison Funston, do you have any thoughts on this one? You know, the idea that it is quite possible to have mental health issues, perhaps even a condition, and also to thrive in life.
Yeah, I think absolutely it is. And I think where you are at any given point depends on many, many things, including the support around you and how you're managing that mental health issue. How, I guess, well, you're able to use all the supports, not necessarily external, but the sorts of things, I guess, the self-care as well. And if you're doing all of those things, then certainly thriving is definitely possible, even for people who do have mental health issues.
So thank you. And so it's not a sentence, is it? When we think about, oh gosh, maybe the demonizing or catastrophization of the language of mental illness, that, you know, often it's something we feel that we need to avoid. In so doing, we might not get the help and support we need, and also overlook the fact that many people are experiencing mental health conditions but are still able to take steps to thrive. Ting Shen, what are your thoughts on this? We'd love to just hear any perspectives, both from the student point of view and also in your role as a mental health first aider.
Yes, so I think it's definitely possible for someone who has a mental health conditions and to be also successful and thriving. And I think it's important to realize that it's quite common, it's quite normal for anyone to have some kind of mental health related issues, whether it's really severe or is it only a very mild issue. That is a very normal thing to have, especially under the current lockdown measures and the pandemic situation. So I think the first important thing is to normalize this, as this is not something that only you have, or this is not something that makes you different or strange, that this happens to everyone. And I think with the support we have through either the university, your friends, your families, and also self-care, that we can manage the conditions to a point that we can still thrive, even though we may have some setbacks. And another point I might just state here, maybe it's jumping a bit early, but I think it's important to seek help at the earliest stage possible. I think some people might think, oh, I'm not that severe enough to qualify to look for help. But I think even if after reaching out for help that you find out this is only a very mild or insignificant problem, then it's a good thing. You know, you're going well. So I would encourage everyone to seek help. Like, I think early intervention is very important in
that's a fabulous term.
Healthy.
Yeah, early intervention. It's kind of imagining this on the continuum, even though it doesn't quite work in this sort of binary way, that perhaps earlier, so somewhere in the languishing and to the right there, earlier intervention will help determine how quickly we move back into a thriving space. And also, at the same time, active intervention, if we need something a little bit more concentrated. Maybe it's because things have compounded and built up, that there's plenty of help and support that we can get. And eventually, we're actually talking about very similar steps that we take for early intervention when we move gradually backwards towards the thriving end. So thank you for raising that. I think early intervention is a key message there. The other things that I took out of your comments, Ting Shen, were the terms support, self-care, managing, just like you would anything else in life, managing your overall well-being rather than leaving it until perhaps it's a little bit later, and not that that's catastrophic either. Thank you very much. Girish, what are your thoughts at the moment? That's a very broad question, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, no, thanks. No, I kind of like what Ting Shen was referring to, because I think normalizing is a very important factor, because, like, for example, I come from India. I don't think I could have ever actually talked about this thing, because there is, in certain cultural environments, it's still taboo to accept that there can be circumstances where it could be mental health issues, because it may be considered as a sign of weakness, or that somebody is not resilient enough to be able to cope up with these things. But actually that's not correct, because, as has been pointed out by other panelists, that these things happen, and these things happen to everyone in different walks of life. So it's very important to acknowledge that these things, mental health issues, can happen, and also to accept that it's outside of just biological factors. Environment, circumstances can play a very key role. And it's not often only up to individual to be able to address that. It's the environment, it's us asking each other, helping each other out is also an important aspect, which is what the Are You OK Day is about, is to kind of talking to each other as well. So recognizing that it's not only biological, or it's not only up to individual to be able to do that, environment, and normalizing, creating an accepting environment that this is not a taboo, this is not a sign of weakness, but it's actually accepting it is the way you acknowledge, and then that's where you come up with solutions on how to kind of mitigate this, or how to figure out, or how to live with it and thrive. I think acceptance is very critical, and recognizing why. And some of the panelists have actually touched on these points already.
I really like that. Thank you. And I love the fact that, you know, there was a word you mentioned there, Girish. You're probably going to guess what this is early on. And I wrote it down thinking, I really want to emphasize that word. And then you said it quite a few times then.
Yeah.
The acceptance factor. It's almost a little bit like, and it's certainly not to trivialize or compare or contrast mental health with physical health challenges, but I've just described this to somebody recently in terms that, imagine you have a headache and for some reason you don't feel safe to mention that you have a headache, and that the starting point, or perhaps you're turning in on yourself with some negative self-talk about having a headache. And the starting point I really like is this concept of acceptance. It's normal and human to have struggles. And then that's you know, almost a catalyst to be able to talk about it. But of course, the questions we ask play a huge role as well. So just to summarize, I think one of the key messages here is that mental health conditions are normal, they are there, they are part of life, in some respects, just like headaches and sore muscles or a sore knee might be a part of life. Denying that it's there is not necessarily going to help, but with the right help and support, you can still go on to thrive. And of course, a big part of this, we'll get to this now, is the supportive conversations that we have. And so I'd like to ask this question, perhaps just from the point of view of being the recipient of somebody reaching out and offering support, perhaps if they're worried about you, whether anyone would like to share their thoughts or experiences on this. Nikki, I wonder if you would mind, what has it been like for you when someone's reached out to you and perhaps said, are you doing okay? Are you all right?
Yeah, I think that it makes a huge difference to know that there are people around you in your life, whether that's family or friends or colleagues, who are keeping an eye on you and care enough and have made the effort and are paying attention to initiate a conversation and to ask about your well-being. And whether they find you in that conversation at a time when you're not doing well, or when that conversation comes at a time when you are, either way, the effort is greatly appreciated. And I think that really helps you to feel like you have resources to draw upon, or people who are supporting you. And perhaps if you're in a phase of life where you are not doing very well and you haven't started to access services or support mechanisms, formal support mechanisms, then to have informal communication about your mental health, and to be encouraged to talk about it, to confide in people, it can be, I think, hugely powerful. So yeah, I think that this is a really important message. I think the Are You OK Day message is really important, to encourage people to normalize these conversations and to encourage us to check in on each other, particularly at the moment in the last year and a half.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nikki, and really appreciate you sharing your personal thoughts and experiences on this as well. I think a couple of key messages there are that, with our social fabric in terms of being social beings, and being wired in a certain way, we've actually got a real opportunity to work with that. It is, in some respects, part of the very the fundamental human condition, isn't it, that we struggle from time to time, and that we feel disconnected. Ironically, sometimes we actually remove ourselves and disconnect ourselves further when we're struggling, when indeed the very thing we need more of is positive social connection, supportive connections and care. And there is it's clinically and even neurochemically another factor here. And I wonder if I could just chime you in on this one, Aronia. Oxytocin, the love drug, the hormone that helps us to feel safe. Does this play a role here in these conversations?
Well, yes, it does. I mean, what we find is if people reach out to each other, it breaks down one barrier, and through and you get positive feelings that someone actually cares. It also helps you then to realize perhaps that this is actually a very serious situation, because we know one of the biggest barriers to getting support is people feeling like, well, maybe this is not serious, or if I wait long enough, it'll go away by itself. And this is the thing that kind of doesn't help with getting early intervention, because people just stay in that state for a long time. So the conversations with people, as you've just described, can help you realize that actually this is really serious, and you feel valued, and the good chemicals flow in the brain because someone is looking at saying this is important, and I care about how things are going, and it helps people move through that barrier of seeking professional help. I mean, we do know that just even in a university context, that at least maybe 1 in 4 to 5 people has a diagnosed mental health condition at any one time, and that's not even looking at a pandemic, contributing even more. So,
and that's diagnosed. You mentioned diagnosed there.
Yes. So that's a diagnosed mental health condition, and that's from a massive national Australian survey of I think it was 16 to 85-year-olds. So coming back to this, a conversation is fantastic. It helps you to realise that maybe, and sometimes that conversation in itself is enough to be the best thing, and that you don't need anything further. But sometimes it can also help to break down that barrier of actually this is really serious, and my friend, colleague, the person who's had the conversation with me, it gives me that help to reflect on that this is actually serious, and I do need to do the next step. So
So it sounds like, in addition to that positive impact in terms of even our biochemistry from that connection, someone reaching out and showing their support and that they care, there is also this concept of insight that comes from the conversation, that perhaps it's that catalyst for you to realize, actually, I've heard a few people say recently to me, "Are you okay? You don't seem yourself."
Yes, absolutely. So it's the person reflecting their concern that makes you realize, actually, this is bigger than I thought, perhaps. As I said, most of us can minimize things and just have that whole thing of, if I wait, it might go away, or you kind of can slide into you're just languishing, or worse, for a long time, and just think this is normal now. And it's the concern expressed by someone else when you do have that conversation that can help to recalibrate, where actually this is actually much more serious, and it's impacting me in a much bigger way than I realized. So there's that element as well.
I think that's a wonderful segue into some of the broader benefits of keeping our expectations in check as well when we're having some of these conversations, that actually it's the not just the belief, the knowledge that every time we have a conversation about mental health, we ask someone, are you okay? I'm just a bit concerned you haven't seemed yourself lately, that it's part of a collective effort for building self-awareness. And I think about this in terms of my own experiences when I've had somebody say to me in the past, yeah, okay, you just don't seem yourself lately. And then, no, I'm fine, thank you. That person probably walked away from that conversation thinking, oh, well, that was a bit, I don't know if I got anywhere then, that was a bit pointless. Then a couple of days later, someone else says something similar, and by the Friday, you know, your mother or your sister says, are you all right? You just don't seem, and then suddenly you think, I've heard that 3 times this week. Has anyone had that experience before? That insight building that comes from maybe the 2nd or 3rd conversation. So every chat we have to believe that actually, and the evidence tells us this is part of a collective insight building process, rather than I'm going to attach some value to whether or not the person opens up and shares with me or has an aha moment straight away. I can see you nodding there, Alison. Alison, would you like to comment on that, or perhaps, and or this proposition that when you are, and altruism is a really important part of this, but when you are offering help and support, which is a part of what you do in your role, that actually it's good for you too. That actually it feels quite nice to be helping people.
Yeah,
ask Alison Campbell, Allison Funston first, then Alison Campbell. So you both nodding there. Yeah.
I guess when you're asking someone if they're okay, and the reaction that you have from that person depends on many, many things. And it might be just you start the thought. And yet the reaction of the person might actually be, oh, of course I'm okay. Why wouldn't I be? But it might be enough to start that. And then, as you said, begin some self-reflection. And maybe that's all that's needed. That might be enough for that person. That the headspace of the person you're talking to can be very different. Right.
So how would you sum that up for somebody in terms of a key message about the value of asking without thinking too much about and getting too involved in your own head about how the person will respond or whether it will have an impact?
I think it's always an important step to ask. And I guess when you're asking, you might be worried about that reaction. Maybe you're upsetting someone. But what you're actually doing is starting a process, and it might be that there's nothing that comes from that at that point. It might be that that person is actually not feeling great, or it might be that they actually are. But I don't think that anticipating those responses should be a barrier to asking. Yeah,
great. That's a really great message. Thanks, Alison. To talk ourselves out of it, which is that avoidant strategy in response when we think, oh, what if that doesn't work, or if I say the wrong thing? So we're going to talk about that shortly in the model that we cover for having this conversation, to keep those expectations in check. And as you say, Alison, just value having the conversation rather than attaching yourself too much to an outcome. Thank you. Alison Campbell, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think my thoughts are, as a person asking the question in the past, sometimes your gut reaction, if you hear someone say, I'm not okay, is to say, oh, there's this problem, let's fix this today. Let's, create a solution. And sometimes it's not the most helpful thing. I found that sometimes people just need someone to listen and to not pursue a solution straight away. Comes back to that idea we've been talking about in terms of letting something mull over in someone's mind. Perhaps they're not ready straight away for a solution. And I think that's a really helpful thing to remember, because if you're coming from a perspective of being well, it's easy to think, oh, I can see what you need right now, and I'm going to prescribe that to you and call it a done deal. But it can be a lot more complex. And I think sometimes time can help, in terms of follow-up conversations and just taking things slowly. Sometimes that can be necessary.
Love it. Thank you. And I really like this conversation about keeping in check our desires, our knee-jerk reactions to try to problem solve. Now, the purpose here is to not, for want of a better way of putting it, do your own heading with how am I going to fix this for the person. Actually, just slow it right down and just be present. Is that kind of the gist of what you're saying there?
Yes, I think it's important to remember that we come from this background of research where we identify a problem, and our whole kind of purpose for work is to fix that problem. But sometimes mental health needs a little bit more time and continued conversations rather than fixing it straight away. Yeah.
Different headspace, isn't it? Thank you. Thanks, Alison. Girish, I want to ask you a question, if I may. The scientific mind and the desire to problem solve, it's quite different to what we're talking about here today, isn't it? Do you have any thoughts on that? If you had to tackle that one yourself, as in, I'm just going to part the way I would handle something if I was problem solving and look at this a bit differently?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question because, I've been confronted with this a few times now because, I tend to, like a scientific mind, Alison pointed out very, very nicely that it's problem solving. That's how scientists think, we want to address this, we want to find a solution. However, one thing that I think which we are a bit scared to do is to, feel something, which is something I've tried of, feeling versus rationalizing thinking all the time. And I think as scientists, we tend to block to feel, that you're not. Yeah. And I think that
feels icky, and I want to problem solve it because that's more familiar and I can control that. Is that a...
And also, the thing is that there is an imposter syndrome that we live with. And the fact that once you do not rationalize, you kind of are festering that imposter syndrome, And I think that's where feeling is quite important. And this happened quite recently, like 3 weeks back. One of my colleagues reached out to me and asked me that, how am I feeling? And for that person to feel that perceptive actually already made me think maybe I gave that vibe that I was not feeling. But this time around, I didn't stop myself. I didn't try to rationalize. And in fact, I got into the conversation with the colleague, and it made it feel so good because you let express things rather than, compartmentalize and find solutions and move on. So I think like I've started valuing a lot that, we should feel free to feel and not try to think.
And not be afraid of that. Yeah, not be afraid of that. Wonderful, thank you. So this balanced approach around our thoughts and problem solving capabilities, which are a wonderful gift in many respects and developed over time, but also the value of consciously parking that. There's a mindfulness to that. We may come back to that a bit later on. Thank you very much, Girish. Vriju has put into the chat room, what are the daily habits we can do in our lives to improve mental health now that gyms are closed? Great question. Now we're going to cover off some of the answers to this at the end of this session. So in about 10 minutes time, we'll talk about that. There is also a question here that we might just park for the very end. Tiklam has asked the question, do we have statistics on how busy public helplines and free counselling services are? I suspect the answer is very busy, but Aronia, we might have a chat about that at the end when we do Q&A. So we'll come back to that question. Thank you very much. So let's talk about the supportive conversations model now. Bearing in mind that often if you are really upset, you often don't really remember exactly what it is that someone said. You remember feeling supported. So just contemplate that for a moment. It's an opportunity to go easy on yourself, to be a little bit kind to yourself and say, you know what, as long as I get some of the key messages here right, and I sit, just listen and be present for someone, that's going to be helpful, rather than I've got to get everything right. So we leave our perfectionists at the door, because that just fuels the whole scientific quandary we get into when we try to problem solve. Just ease into this one. So the supportive conversation, it's asking the question. This is the "Are you okay?" model. Listening, encouraging action. So what would you like to do next? And a check-in. As Alison Campbell said, you know, there's a follow-up point. So that also lets us off the hook in having to get this absolutely right, because I always suggest and like to think of this as a series of conversations rather than a one-off. Oh, I had a go, that didn't quite work. So I'm going to come back and check in anyway. So I want to share with you this globe model. This session is also being recorded, so you can come back to it, and we'll organise some tip sheets to come out to everyone and be available after the session today as well. So the globe model is 5 simple steps. We'll just run through this fairly efficiently, and then at the end, in some optional extra time, we'll hang around. You can ask me any questions you like. The G stands for get organised. Kind of what we're doing now, organising our thoughts about what this is and what it isn't. The L, let's talk about it. The O, observe confidentiality. I'm just going to share with you a very quick, learnable way of answering this question. Oh, can I talk to you, but you promised me you won't tell anyone. The B, be prepared for different reactions. We're going to talk about that briefly. Basically, it's about saying, if we know what some of the reactions are, we won't let those reactions stop us or hijack the conversation. We know how to, it'll be okay. And the E, establish an outcome. There's always a next step. So I won't run through all of the slides on this, because they will be in the handouts and in the follow-up video for you to stop and pause anytime you want to hone in on any of these key points. But the key thing about getting organised, I think, is just consider what have you noticed about this person? Has something changed? Has something shifted? Perhaps they're a little bit more quiet than usual, or maybe they just seem a little bit flat. Or I haven't noticed anything, but I'm just going to ask you anyway. Just make a mental note of that. You haven't seen yourself lately can be helpful if you are concerned about someone's well-being. The L, let's talk about it. This is the key here. If it's true, I've been worried about you, or otherwise just wondering, just an early chat. Are you okay? Just seem a little bit flat in the last day or so. And so there are so many of us who experience mental health issues, and we just want to normalize this. Don't try to be a diagnostician. You're not here to say, do you think you've got depression? Or to be a counsellor, unless that is your role, Aronia, unless that is your role. And just a quick thing, you can say to somebody, look, I don't feel appropriately qualified to help you with all of this, but I'm here for you. Perhaps we could talk about some other support, some people who are qualified to help. How does that sound? And of course, counselling service, qualified counsellor, GPs are also a great place to start as well, and an option, because they are very qualified in triaging concerns around mental health, and they can also help you to access Medicare benefits for counselling support services. So I think this is important if you are in a workplace context, and maybe you're worried the person might be, why are you asking this? I'm just concerned about your well-being. You haven't seen yourself lately. The O, observe confidentiality. If you need to put it into words, that is, somebody says, I do want to talk to you, but I need to know that you're not going to tell anyone. This is a confidential conversation, absolutely. However, depending on what it is that you have to tell me, we might need to get somebody else involved. But if that's the case, we can talk about that. Then we can talk through some options. How does that sound? Now, in my work over the years, including in some pretty difficult conflict resolution processes, I've never had somebody say, oh no, that doesn't sound okay to me. Never had someone say, oh no, I won't tell you then. So I think it's just helpful to have this in your back pocket and just to remember what it is you want to say in really simple terms. You don't need to go into all the details. Of course, the details would include situations where somebody reveals that they might be considering harming themselves or somebody else if there's a serious threat to life, health, or safety. They're the main things. And the B, be prepared for different reactions. So I'm going to put this out there. What might your biggest concern be, or what might a common concern be about the kinds of reactions that you might get? I've got time for one panel member to talk to this. What do you see as being one of the obstacles, Ting Shen, perhaps that people worry about? Oh, I don't want to ask that question because.
Yeah, so I think maybe the most common concern is that you fear that the other person feels that you are crossing the boundary into their personal life, and you are maybe the fear that they think you are judging them based on their look or performance. Maybe that's the reason you're asking this.
Great point.
Yeah, so I think those two may be the biggest concerns.
Thank you. So the position that I would recommend, this will come out in the tip sheets as well, is to be able to say, or be prepared to say, look, I absolutely respect your boundaries, and just signpost the concern that's popped up. If it's boundaries, look, I absolutely respect your boundaries, and I don't want you to think I'm forcing you to talk about something that you don't want to talk about. However, I just want to let you know I'm here if you need anything, and I'll just check in on you. You don't have to talk in detail with me about this though. So just take your time rather than, and certainly hold back and just catch any thoughts that, oh, well, I'm just trying to be nice, and I need to debate this with this person. Go gently and just take your time. Of course, you don't need to talk with me about this, but I'm here if you need anything. And we could talk about some other help and support. Your point about performance, you having a go at me, is this about me not doing something right or doing something well? We have this little part of our brains, or parts that are connected, called the default mode network. And part of that is quite self-critical. And so people will sometimes, and we've all done it, I'm sure, from time to time, jump to a conclusion, oh no, this is a criticism, there's something wrong with me. And so it's quite helpful just to know that and be compassionate about that, and just to offer a reassuring word. Absolutely not about a criticism or your performance. This is purely a conversation about your well-being. I'm just concerned about your well-being. So slow it right down and just repeat. Absolutely just a conversation about your well-being. If you are in a role where you are concerned about someone's performance and it's part of your job, separate that out. We always say, just keep that completely separate and don't mix them. Don't mix the conversation with a performance conversation. It's always separate, and draw the boundary there. I'm going to put a boundary here because I am really concerned about your well-being. I'm not wanting to talk about anything to do with performance right now. And so there may be denial. There may be upset and crying and just sitting with somebody. This is where we say park your problem solving, just sit with them. It's the tone, it's the reassuring, and taking time. So taking more time than you think you might need for these conversations, just to sit. And in some ways it's called bearing witness, just to sit with somebody. And then making sure that they're safe. And so shame might become part of it as well, and that might project or might come out in the form of hostility or annoyance, and that's okay. I would just say, don't take that personally. This is not about you and you asking. It's very, very common and in some ways quite normal for people when we're struggling to get a bit cranky and reactive as well. So just slow it right down, sit with the person and always check in with them. And there might be relief as well on the inside. You might not find out about that, or you might find out during a follow-up conversation. There's some reassuring things we can say, and I'll just point out that they're there on the slide, and you can come back and have a look at these both in the video and the tip sheet. It's okay, we can take our time. If the person says, I'm so embarrassed, if they're in tears, there's absolutely no need to be embarrassed. We can all struggle from time to time. Would it help if we talk through some options to get some help and support? This is a really good one from time to time to repeat, so the person knows there's plenty there in terms of help and support. We don't push that, certainly don't push it too quickly. And just remembering I'm not suitably qualified unless it is part of your role to be a professional counsellor. And you can actually say, look, I don't feel suitably qualified to help you with all of this. I'm here for you. Perhaps we could talk about getting some help and support. Always thank the person for sharing as well. It's such a good step forward. Thank you so much. And establishing an outcome while respecting their boundaries and privacies. Make a commitment to follow up. Now, I've had someone say, no, it's all right. I don't need to catch up with you again, which I didn't take personally. I did question at the time, but the point there was, look, I certainly won't make you, I'm not going to ask you to talk to me about things that you don't feel comfortable talking with me about, but I'm going to check in with you anyway and say hi and see how you're going. Okay. Otherwise, we can actually make a time if the person's comfortable with that. Yes, I'll talk to my GP, I'll talk to the counselling service. Oh, when do you think you might do that? Should we organise to catch up next Wednesday or Thursday? That's 10 o'clock or 3 o'clock. A couple of simple choices can be really, really helpful. Now, it's a little bit of a speed dating session today, but we do have some tips and advice on what can be helpful. It is almost 2 o'clock. So for those of you who need to get going, I'm going to cover off a couple of these key points, and then I'll invite you to stay around and have a chat. The PERMA model, this was a model that was coined by Professor Martin Seligman, University of Pennsylvania. If you're interested, you might like to have a look at the book Flourish that he wrote in, I think, about 2010. And he came up with 5 things that are essential for people to thrive or to flourish. And we know this helps, whether you're languishing or you want to prevent issues from occurring, or even if you're not well. Some of this is always helpful. PERMA, the P stands for positive emotion. Gratitude and optimism, reaching out and offering and even asking for support helps build positive emotion. Engagement, using your strengths. Those times when you think, gosh, I've just got to get through this. If you're interested, the VIA character strengths test is a really neat, free, confidential test that will give you a list of 24 character strengths. If you do that, just Google VIA character strengths. The top 5 in your list are called your signature strengths. And if you play to those each day, it just becomes a little easier to get through challenging situations, and you might even get into a state of what we call flow or the zone. Relationships that are positive and supportive, absolutely key mainstay. That's why we're all here today. Of good mental health. Sense of meaning or purpose, this is probably more about focusing in on what's important to you and using that as a catalyst. In the context for today, I would say, reaching out to somebody, it's meaningful and purposeful. And that's going to help me to thrive as well, in addition to focusing in on those things that give you joy, that are important to you personally. The A stands for accomplishment, setting goals, taking action, ticking the boxes as you go. As Alison mentioned earlier, this is a really good way to help you to be in a state of what we could call thriving, even if you're not feeling particularly great, even if you're struggling a little bit. Ticking the boxes and celebrating some achievements along the way, incredibly important. And just finally, exercise, nutrition, sleep, real mainstays as well. Exercise, obviously that's going to help produce a few extra of those happy and reward neurochemicals, serotonin, dopamine, endorphins, which are a natural pain reliever as well, all get stimulated when you're exercising. Nutrition, this is not a nutrition session, but we all know that it helps in terms of our mental health as well as our physical health. Sleep, do get help and support if you're struggling with sleep. And practicing mindfulness, even just a few breaths to bring you back into the present moment. Now, I'm going to place up, before we open up the conversation, that's optional, of course, we are just after 2 o'clock now. There are some podcasts that our organisation has released today, and I'd like to just let you know about those, and I'll pop the link in the chat room as well, so you can just click on that. No, that's not quite working. So this link, see if I can actually copy that while the slides are live. I can't, but we will send that out with a copy of the video and the tip sheets afterwards. A few podcasts there, including on having healthy conversations about mental health. So hope you find those helpful. So for those of you who want to stick around, we're going to have a conversation now just briefly about what each of the panelists do to look after themselves. And I'd also just like to thank you all very, very much for coming along today in advance. If you need to pop off, thanks so much for joining us. Look after yourselves. Do look out for the video if you want to come back and refresh yourself on any of these materials. Thank you all very, very much to our panelists as well, who I'm now going to ask the magical question: what do you do? What's good for you to look after your own mental health? So the funny one, isn't it, Aronia, given that you spend all of your waking hours, no doubt, looking out for other people's mental health? What do you do for yourself?
So the things that matter to me are kind of living life within values. So, you know, doing something every day that I think is meaningful and important for me, and, you know, taking that longer term perspective on that too. You know, in 5 years' time, I want to look back and say, yes, that was, you know, I did things that were important to do for me. So I think that really helps me. Maintaining and just continually working on the social connections, family, friends, colleagues. I think ultimately we're all social beings, and you know, it doesn't come automatically, that thing. So you have to work on that, you know, make an effort. We can't go and visit people, but, you know, we can do a phone call, we can Zoom, we can do something. Those are important things. All the things you said about just trying to keep healthy mind, body, you know, eating well, those things are important. And probably the last thing for me is just also monitoring that. As I said earlier, I like to watch the news and hear about what's happening, but I have to monitor how much of that I do, because it does make me more anxious. Like, you know, hearing a lot of bad news all day, I find that does make me more stressed. And, you know, I want to hear some of it, but I do monitor that. So I just keep it at a level that's informative, but not mentally impactful. So they're the kind of key things I try and do.
Great advice from the expert. Thanks, Aronia. And I really relate to that as well. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that, and your personal experience with anxiety-inducing news, I should say, to monitor that and moderate that. I think that's a very wise bit of advice. Thank you very much. I might ask Allison Funston next. Would you mind, Allison, sharing with us something you do for your well-being?
So I guess a couple of things. One of the main ones is actively making sure you get out, and even if it's gentle exercise, some exercise, just a walk to somewhere where there's some nature. I really like the beach. The beach is great. Fortunately, it's not within my 5 kilometre zone. So I walk to a little park that's got some native trees and birds in it instead.
Yeah. Beautiful.
So that's certainly one thing. But getting out, thinking and seeing different things can really help.
Gets you out of your head, doesn't it, as well? Just gets your head where your body is instead. And I really love that. You know, you're sort of making adjustments to get some nature, even if it's not the ideal of what you perfectly want, you're still doing it. And the research shows, it's research from Harvard Medical School last year, tracked the trajectory of people's cortisol levels, stress hormone, and in particular when they were sitting in nature. And it was noticed that around about 30 minutes in nature was optimal for a measurable reduction in stress hormones, which obviously enables then a bit more serotonin to be released and come through. So that's very, very helpful. Thanks so much, Alison. Nikki, how about you? We were talking about cooking earlier. Anything else
Yeah, so I listed those things that I try to do for myself, which is I find meditation is really useful for learning to kind of tune out your thinking mind, which can be quite critical of ourselves. You know, the little voice in your head that's providing a commentary for how you're doing with your things. If you can learn to just take a step away from that sometimes, then that's really helpful. And meditation is a good tool for practicing how to do that. Yeah, exercise is really important. One of the questions we had was, you know, how can we have good daily habits when the gyms are closed? And that's something that I was talking to my partner about just a few minutes ago. I find that going to the gym is really helpful for me. If you expend a lot of energy, then you can get an endorphin release, and it just helps to regulate my mood and reduce levels of anxiety. And it's not always as easy to reach the same levels of physical intensity by exercising outside. You might have some health conditions that prevent you from doing things like running or you know, using your body to do exercises in the same way that you might be able to do in a different environment. So that's obviously not ideal at the moment, but I guess what I try and do is what I can at the moment, which is to go out for a walk, sometimes to go out for a jog, and to do things like yoga, or just to do like a short workout, things like push-ups and sit-ups that you can do if you're able to without gym equipment. So and there we're kind of looping back into that concept of acceptance. Like, it's not, the situation is not optimal at the moment. We can't do everything we want to do, but doing what you can, I think, is really important.
Absolutely love that theme, and it's really that list starts to get quite long, doesn't it, Nikki? When you're making a list of things I can do, and I think about, gosh, I think I've learned something from you right now, and I think about how devastated I've been for weeks and weeks and weeks not being able to get to Pilates, and it's one thing that I love, but I haven't made that huge list of all the other things I could be doing. And once I do that, realize very quickly I've got a lot of choice, which in itself is no doubt therapeutic. Got some choice there. Thank you very, very much. Ting Shen, how about you? What do you do to look after yourself, your own well-being?
Yeah, so for me, I think there's multiple aspects to this. The first one is that being physically separated from your colleagues, your friends, and maybe your families, it's important that you stay connected virtually, either through messages, phone calls, or other means. So in our research group, we have, for example, we use a team channel to communicate, and we also have kind of daily trivia in the afternoon before lunchtime.
Bit of fun, yeah.
Yes, and also we also have a WhatsApp group. We also have a Discord group. So it's the more connected you are with your colleagues, your friends, I think it makes the situation more bearable. And the other
bearable, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great and word. The other thing I think is important is to accept the current situation a bit more. So as researchers, we usually work in the lab. We usually work more than what a common 9-to-5 job person do. Like, we have maybe 9 to 7. And I think it is okay to think now currently you can't work as much as you want. And as a experimentalist myself, the only thing I can do right now is kind of do some literature review and maybe write up some part of the thesis or your paper. But besides that, there's not much formal work that you can do. And I think it's important to acknowledge that this is okay. It's not the end of the world. And a lot of other people are in the same boat as you. And also it's important. Yeah, and it's also important to find some things that, so if you have done all of the literature review and you don't have anything that you can write right now, you can use this opportunity to learn some other things. For example, I've learned how to use latex in one of the previous lockdowns. And also I also was trying to learn how, for example, you can try to learn how to use 3D modeling to make figures, or how to edit videos, or even if you're just spending some more time to do things that you enjoy. So for example, maybe you can spend some more time playing games, and just some distraction from the lockdown will help to maintain your mental health.
So it's quite a list there of things that you can be doing. Once again, making that list of things you can't do start to pale into insignificance in some ways. And that word again, acceptance. The reality is we all want to be back together. We all want to be in physical spaces together again. And at the moment we can't. But that acceptance also is no doubt a big part of driving your action towards things you can do. Speaking of which, thank you so much, Ting Shen. Perhaps one example from Alison and then Girish, our Sydney colleagues there. Would you mind just sharing one thing that you do for your wellbeing, Alison?
Yes, I'm privileged to live with family, and I really enjoy talking to them. So often in all of my different moods, I'm always encouraged when I have time to talk with them. And I will say one more thing that I do that I find really helpful is I pray a lot. And so I find that a really great help for my mental health.
The spiritual world is a significant one that also feeds into that and is connected with that, what Martin Seligman refers to as the meaning or purpose that takes on a spiritual dimension for a lot of us as well. Thank you very much, Alison. Girish, how about you? Last but not least.
Yeah, I mean, I've started going for a jog, for walks, and I think that's a good way to block things out, and you can be with yourself a bit, and get an opportunity to reflect. And I think I've been enjoying that. And I mean, and same as Nikki, I love cooking, so that's one thing that I do try a lot of different things. And yeah, I've had some successful experiments so far. So yeah, it's been a bit rewarding. I like that. Well, it's a stress buster to do something.
Yeah, it is indeed, isn't it? And no doubt something you can be quite mindful around as well in terms of practicing mindfulness while you're doing your food preparation. Very present in the moment. No doubt you get lots of aromas and smells that you can indulge yourself in.
Oh, definitely. Definitely.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Girish. I'll just point out as well that Paul Mulvaney's popped a couple of articles, links to articles in the chat room. So thank you to Paul. I think he's gone, but Coping with Mental Health the Chemist's Way talks about oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin, a couple of age articles, and another one on the vagus nerve and relaxation response. Very, very helpful. Still here. Thanks so much, Paul. Really, really useful articles. And this is all about building upon your own, our own self-awareness in a way as well. So there's a lot of science to this that we can learn, and a lot of emotional intelligence-based approaches we can take, including around building our insight, building our empathy levels, even towards ourselves, self-compassion. So that's probably a good note to end up on today. There is a question from Saray in the chat room. I might just suggest that if you want to hang around for that, I'm very, very happy with that. I'll have a go at answering it, but if you need to get going, I'll also say thank you once again. And thank you to our panelists very, very much. Thank you, Allison Funston. Very nice to see you here today. Hope you get out into the outdoors, the park, and hope you get to the beach soon.
That would be nice. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Aronia. Great to hear your wise and sage counsel and advice today. Some of those really helpful tips. Thank you very much, and for the wonderful work that you do as well.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Ting Shen. Great to hear your wisdom and your positive energy towards doing things. You're a real doer, and that list of things you can be doing rather than getting stuck in the things you can't. So incredibly inspiring. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Alison Campbell, very, very wise and open sharing today. Thank you very, very much. Really appreciate you sharing with us your thoughts about both the conversations, the value of these conversations, and your own perspectives on life as well. Thank you.
My pleasure. Great to be in the conversation.
Likewise. Thanks very much, Girish. Thank you so much. Thanks also for your wisdom around some of those cross-cultural conversations, the intersectionality that is such an important part of our inclusive conversations about mental health and other things. So thank you so much, Girish.
Thanks for having me, and thanks, Mark, for actually such a fabulous workshop. And I think it's good to have these conversations, and I'm thankful to you for actually chairing and bringing light to a lot more information.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you so much. It's delightful, and it's indeed my pleasure. I was very grateful for the opportunity and to be asked here today. So I want to also thank the people at Exciton Science and Nikki, last but not least, for your incredible work in putting all of this together. This is a really great initiative, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone here, and I say thank you so much to you and to your team for making this happen today, and for you sharing so generously today as well.
No worries. Thanks very much for your help leading the session, Mark. It's been really engaging and insightful, and I really appreciate the effort that you've made putting all this information together for us and asking sensible questions to draw out people's insight and their perspective. And thanks again to all the panelists who are here today for accepting the invitation to join us. And I really appreciate your time and your perspective and insight. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, good luck, everyone, and have a lovely afternoon. Do look out for the materials. This is part of a journey, so let's not get stuck in the idea that we have to get anything perfectly right, ever, really. Well, unless you're working on a major experiment, but we'll leave that to another conversation for another day. Take good care of yourselves. I'm going to stick around if any of our panelists would like to, very, very welcome to. And I'm just going to address Saray's question now. Being an introvert, I know some people hesitate to share their struggles, mild or intense. What are some of the signs that someone is actually not okay, even if they say, I am okay? Saray, I think that's a very thoughtful, considerate question. I'm just going to summarize my thoughts on this one, which really relate to this idea that when we get to know people, we see what is the normal for them, what is the in the zone of, oh, that's Mark, that's what Mark's usually like. But when something changes, and not necessarily something for the better, something that concerns us, that it is a change that might indicate some issues, like the person being more withdrawn than usual, or if they are really introverted, that perhaps the person might be acting out in a different way to what is the norm for them. Flatness, more profound withdrawal. So introversion isn't the same as withdrawal, but if you see some profound sign of withdrawal, that the person's not showing up anymore, or perhaps they're saying things that indicate some of those little things they might say, an intensified self-critical thought process, that could be a warning sign. Not sleeping, being excessively tired could be a sign. Hard to tell, I appreciate your point. If someone's introverted, they're probably less likely to want to talk about what's going on. So you're kind of operating off what I might think of as instincts, but actually it's sometimes it's our us picking up subconsciously on some things that have changed for that person. I might ask our mental health first aiders if they have any thoughts or comments on that, particularly in relation to someone who might be naturally a little bit more introverted. Thoughts on that, Alison Campbell?
Yes, I mean, it's sometimes it can be hard to tell, especially when you're working remotely in a pandemic. But I think that's really the importance of this day, isn't it? To give people the opportunity to come forward, to enter into a conversation, whether you think they're going okay or not. Yeah, I don't know that I can offer much more, because I think you're right that the more you know someone, the more you're able to tell whether they are their normal self or not. So just keeping an open mind for those situations where you don't know someone, and to just keep asking, you know, not every day, maybe that's too much, but at regular intervals, you know, just checking in, how are you going? It's always a helpful question.
Yeah, and I agree that repeated check-in is important, because they themselves may not be aware that they are in a some kind of problem, but if you approach them like consistently, they might start to think, oh, maybe there's something wrong. And also, I think I also encourage everyone to maybe consider taking a mental health first aid course with the university. It's not, it doesn't only help you, give you the ability to help others, but it also help yourself to understand these matters better. Yeah.
Absolutely, that's a great point. I like that very much. So that continued sort of educational process, and for some it is about joining groups or an individual pathway to self-discovery, including through mindfulness or meditation or religious practice. And it could be, you've also got those choices around something a little bit more structured and formalized, like a mental health first aid course. Like that very much. Thank you very much. Great note, I think, for us to finish up on today. I'm going to stop sharing, because I have realized I can put that, if anyone wants that link in the chat room, I can do that if I stop sharing in the slideshow. So I'll just do that now, and then we'll follow up with a series of links and attachments as well. So there's that link to the podcast. Thank you all very, very much. Thanks again to our panelists. Thanks, Nikki. Hope you enjoy the rest of your holiday. Get back to that now.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks,
wonderful
Ting Shen.
talk.
Thanks,
Thank
Alison.
you.
You take care. Thank you. Thanks for your help today, Josh.